So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is the third in a series of webinars on the topic of paleo data stewardship through the past Global Changes program. I'm Darrell Kaufman. I'm a member of the Pages Scientific Steering Committee, and I have the pleasure today of welcoming Professor Jack Williams. Jack is a professor in geography and is a member of the Center for Climate Research at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He's a paleoecologist and a biogeographer. He specializes in species response to past and future climate changes, and he's a leader in paleoecology informatics. He's one of the principal scientists and one of the primary movers behind the Neotoma Paleoecology Database, which is one of the world's premier resources for past global change research. In fact, Neotoma and Pages are partners, and they share a lot in common. Besides promoting fair data principles in paleosciences, Neotoma it's highly collaborative, it's international, it's interdisciplinary, it's community-driven, and it facilitates major advances in paleosciences at regional and global scales. So, Jack, thank you for taking the time for being with us. For those listening in, please feel free to use the chat if you have questions, and there'll be time after the presentation for further discussion. So, thank you, Jack.
Okay, well, thank you, Darrell. And of course, thank you, Sarah, for organizing this. Really fun to be here. And of course, thanks all for taking some time today. Looking forward to talking. So what I'll do, I assume that some people in this audience have heard of Neotoma, but maybe just in passing or haven't heard about it at all. There might be some people here who also are active contributors to or users of Neotoma data. So for this talk, I've designed it as kind of an overview, kind of walking through some of the main components of Neotoma, but I'll sprinkle in some updates and kind of latest changes along the way for people who are more familiar with Neotoma can see some of the current things that we're actively working on and are in progress. I also want to acknowledge with this slide, the next one, that as Darrell said, lots of people are involved in Neotoma. I serve as the chair of the executive working group, along with Jessica Blois, Thomas Giesecke, Eric Grimm, and Allison Smith. And the executive working group is part of a larger body called the Leadership Council that sets the policy and sort of acts as the scientific stewards of the database. So I'm representing lots of people here. All right, so I'll give an intro. I'll talk about some of the key concepts in the Neotoma data model and growth trends. Then equally important, perhaps more important, talking about some of our key concepts in community curation and how to govern a large international multi-proxy data resource and policies of data use. Then talk a bit about some of the services for software that are available, and then just a highlight or two of some of the science that's being powered by this kind of work. All right, so again, really just want to say lots of people are contributing in lots of different ways. A really key concept is that we have people who are data stewards. These are people who are actively uploading data. They have expert knowledge in their domains. They come from fields of palynology, diatoms, ostracods, terrestrial vertebrates, geochemistry, lots of different people from lots of different parts of the world putting data in, organized into these constituent databases that I'll talk more about later on. I also certainly want to acknowledge support. Most of our funding has come from the U.S. National Science Foundation and the Geoinformatics EarthCube and Sedimentary Geology and Paleobiology program. We've also got some funding recently for a couple projects from the Belmont Forum. So really that's what makes a lot of this possible. And then, a key goal for us has been kind of accreditation and recognition. And so as Darrell mentioned, being recognized by Pages is really important to us as a trusted place to put data, along with NOAA Paleoclimatology and Pangea as sort of three currently recommended Pages data repositories. We're listed as an NSF approved data repository. So if you have an NSF grant and want a place to put your data, Neotoma can be a home for it. And then the ICSU is a sort of international registry of trusted and approved world data systems. And then, there's lots of different people we're partnering with as we're all trying to build out this ecosystem of these data resources and components. We kind of work with different people in different contexts. And so just kind of showing some different partners down there. And just to kind of start with the motivation, why do this? Why invest time and effort by any of us into this kind of effort? For me, as Darrell mentioned, very strongly motivated by global change and the promise that paleo records have a really important part to bring to bear on global change. We're living through a period of geological scale climate change. Does it have geological precedent or not? Well, clearly we're going outside the historical record in terms of the range and scale of variability. So we want to look for analogs or at least model systems for what's happening today, looking at things like past glacial, interglacial cycles, or going as far back as the Pliocene, say, or even the PETM, for finding for at least partial analogs in meaningful ways for the changes happening now. So bringing all that knowledge to bear about how species have evolved or moved or responded to those climate changes of the past. Then in lower left, GBIF as a group that has been very successful in building up a global resource of all species occurrences or species occurrences worldwide. Every dot there represents a location where a scientist or there's been some observation of a species at a point, really powering and enabling these global biodiversity studies and wanting to achieve that kind of coverage and capability for all the many, many records we have going back in time through the past. Using that information to power our better ecological forecasts, right? Using this data to make our models better, improving our ability to predict where the world will be over the coming years to decades, given different scenarios of, say, climate change. And then this last challenge of archival, that we all know that data is lost over time, that we write our paper, we move on to the next project, we lose the notebook, the server crashes. There's all kinds of ways that data gets lost, and all that hard-won effort in getting that data and finding it goes to waste. And so efforts like Neotoma also have this very important archival mission, in addition to their maybe their equally important science mission. So Neotoma then, its mission is to support global change research by providing an open, anyone can use it, high quality, community curated data resource for different kinds of paleoecological data. We, adding value by doing such things as making sure that our variable names are standardized. So we have a defined dictionary of variable names. So if somebody misspells a taxon name somewhere, we clean that as we go. We correct kind of common errors like that can really hinder larger scale data syntheses. We have our data model able to handle multiple cores from a site, multiple samples from a core. It's a very flexible data approach. And then ways of, I'll talk more a little bit about flexible ways of handling time through our storage of the radiocarbon dates or other age controls, and then the inferred age depth models. Those numbers there are actually a little out of date. I must not have updated that particular part of the slide, but we have now over 7 million observations worldwide, over 30, I think over 37,000 data sets and 17,000 sites now. So again, one of those challenges in the big data era is like, how do you manage all this data? And this is large from the sense in the perspective of being an individual scientist trying to compile data together and really making it possible to bring all this data and knowledge to bear. Okay, right. So so moving then to what is Neotoma? Now we've kind of talked about the why have Neotoma. So it is a couple different things at once. It is a database, and there in fact are the updated numbers there in lower left from May of this year. It's a database, right? So it contains species occurrences or abundances for different taxa at different places. It includes radiocarbon dates and other age controls. It stores increasingly different kinds of geochemical information, like stable isotopes in different places. So that's one thing that Neotoma is, and that's often the first thing that people think of when they think about what is Neotoma. But it's also a set of software that goes with that database, right? There, there's the backend relational database that all this is stored in, but then there's also a series of software packages and resources that go with it. We have Tilia that Eric Grimm is the lead developer of, and that's what we both use to upload sites into Neotoma and make sure that all the data cleaning is done. So it's a primary tool used by the data stewards, cleaning and preparing data for upload to Neotoma. You can also download data from Neotoma back to Tilia, so it's also a good place to look closely at individual sites and what they hold. And then there's other tools as well. There's Neotoma Explorer, which is usually the first point of contact that many people use when they're first learning about Neotoma, a map-based interface for exploring and looking at Neotoma data. We have the APIs, the programmatic interfaces for extracting data from Neotoma. And then we have the Neotoma R package that sits on top of that. I'll talk about these a little bit more later on. But then, sitting on top of that, this top tier is the stuff that we have supported and developed and within the Neotoma team. But then by making the APIs kind of open source and available, the R package open source and available, then other people started to build on these tools and started to build their own capabilities. So NOAA Paleoclimatology is you can search there through their paleoclimatic data portals and retrieve Neotoma pollen data currently. And we're working with them right now to extend their data retrieval services to other kinds of Neotoma data. The Earth Life Consortium is a resource for looking and searching across different paleobiological data resources. And it has some tools that you can search Neotoma, the Paleobiology Database, and other data resources. The Global Pollen Project, which is a kind of a library of pollen images, helping people identify their pollen types. And that will query into Neotoma to look at maps of where different pollen types are found. And then Flyover Country as a third-party app that mostly based in the US, but not exclusively, where as you travel from place to place, you can get information about the kinds of rocks you're flying over, where the mammoths or dinosaurs have been found, and other things like that. That's also drawing upon Neotoma resources. So to me, one of the important points here is that once you make data open, all kinds of wonderful things happen and all kinds of other things start to get leveraged, things that you yourself can never do. And so creating these open data resources really powers a whole new layer and possibilities for innovation. And it's a system for data governance that when you are working with different kinds of data from different regions and nobody has all expertise, I have my area of expertise in pollen, but I don't know anything about vertebrates, and everybody's got their own domain. We need some kind of system that both centralizes the data management, the back-end infrastructure, the software, but then distributes the governance. So you need ways for different people to be able to have ownership of different parts. And so the way we have kind of organized this conceptually is that we have the leadership council that I mentioned that acts as sort of a steering and coordinating committee for the entire group. But then a very key component of that is down at bottom there, the constituent databases and data stewards, where different groups are in charge with different parts of the data. So for example, there's the European pollen database and the Latin American pollen database. There's the vertebrate database for North America, and there's a test amoeba database. So the idea being that different portions of the data stored in Neotoma are curated by different communities, and those communities and those stewards can both upload data, they can correct errors, they can update data. So they have the editing privileges, but only for their data domain within Neotoma. So I can't go in and edit the vertebrate data because I don't know anything about it. It wouldn't be wise for me to do that. But I do have editing privileges as a steward for the North American pollen data. So that's kind of my domain of expertise. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a little bit too. So this is just some of the overviews. But it's really important again to kind of land that point that it's a database and it's a software ecosystem and it's a community governance structure. And they're all kind of co-bound together. All right, so some concepts, we could spend more time in any of these, but it's just to kind of understand some of the features of the data. If you kind of dive into the relational database model that's sitting behind all of this, it's got a couple different ways that things are organized. And this is all designed by Eric. Eric has both designed the Neotoma data model and the Tilia software. One thing it's got is a very important concept. There's this hierarchy where you go from sites to collection units within sites to analysis units within a collection unit, and then samples within those analysis units. And so a site would be like a lake or a cave or an archaeological site. Those would become a geographic entity. The collection units would then be the cores or the pits or the bone piles or other spatially discrete locations within your site that you're going to take some data from. And then the analysis units and the samples are basically the vertical horizons where you go layer by layer, level by level, and take a series of measurements from your you're sampling your core or your cross-section road cut or what have you. And then the data sets, a data set in Neotoma terminology, are all samples of a given same type from a collection unit. So all the pollen samples from a single core would be a data set. All the diatoms from that same core would be a different data set. So that's how we define and bound data sets. So that's a quick overview there. And then another quick overview is just to talk about time. So we have, in our structure, the radiocarbon dates, the lead-210 dates, the other age controls are the raw data that, and usually will not change that much after the first measurement and reporting. And so those are stored in one table, the geochronology table, that's pretty stable and does not change that much. But then, age depth models change all the time. We get new statistical packages like Bacon or Bcron. We now have IntCal 20, so we need to go back and revise all of our calibrations that used to use IntCal 13. So the age depth models get revised regularly. So we have another set of tables that store those, the metadata about those models, and then the chronologies are essentially the combination of those two, and then the age inferences that come out of that. So we can store for a given depth in a given core or collection unit multiple age inferences based upon the different age depth models that have been run over the years. And we can have a preferred or kind of, what would be the default one if you were to just kind of go in and pick one quickly. So that's a few key concepts about the data model. And then, a key point is about data growth. One of the real values of having this community curated approach is that almost always there are these key bottlenecks with building these large databases, which is it is labor intensive. And one thing we want to do is make it less labor intensive to add data into it. The process of uploading data, cleaning data, standardizing data, that takes expert judgment and some time. And so by distributing this expertise and workload among a broader community of stewards, we can then increase the rates of data upload. And what we're looking at here is kind of a data volume. So the y-axis, which should have a label on it, is sort of number of data points, total data points in the millions in Neotoma. Neotoma's first grant that got it started was in 2009. And before that, there was individual separate databases like the Global Pollen Database or FaunMap, or these kind of discrete continent scale or taxa scale databases. They existed, they pre-existed, but now there's been this effort to coalesce them into Neotoma and then start to add new data to Neotoma. And then you can see that real inflection point about 2014. And that's when Eric released Tilia with this new functionality for data stewards to upload data to Neotoma, to make corrections and so forth. And that's when we've had this very rapid growth ever since then. So as of last May, we're over 7 million data points. And you can measure data growth and data volume in different ways. So you can see number of sites, you can see number of data sets, number of data points in the upper right there, number of publications, authors stored in Neotoma, countries. We have metadata about the publications and authors and so forth. So you can see that lower right one now, we now have 100 countries now represented in Neotoma. We've hit the 100 country mark. Okay, so that's kind of a summary of some of the key data concepts and growth. Then to talk about this key, I think for this community, it's really important for people who are involved in Pages to think about how do you, just as in Pages, how do you have an international coordinating body, given many different kinds of research and many different countries and people involved? For Neotoma, how do you build a community international multi-proxy data resource? And so here's some of the key elements of that. So one key concept, and this is a figure that was from a special issues of Pages magazine from 2018 that Darrell and I co-led with a couple of others, that really talk about this concept of data stewardship and thinking about open community resources and both the services provided to the community and the services received from the community, this very important symbiotic relationship. And then further separating or kind of thinking about in the community how there is at least 3 roles. There are the people who generate data. They go out and take new cores. They work in the lab and generate new measurements, the data generators. There are the people who are the data synthesizers. They are gathering lots of observations together. They're cleaning, they're standardizing, they're updating age models. They do that work. And then there are the people who are the data stewards, who are kind of working as a point of interface between the databases. And you can see how the diagram is drawn here is that these are three overlapping communities. Most of us, especially in this day and age, can move among these different roles. There are some times where my lab, we're out generating new data. And there's other times where my lab, we're trying to like look at our data in context with other records that other people have collected. So you can, these are not distinct communities, these are overlapping communities here. And then thinking about the services received and provided, data generators, they add their data to Neotoma or other open community data resources. You can see I've got an icon for the Paleobiology database, which is kind of very similarly structured. They add their data to Neotoma, and then they receive services of DOIs being assigned to their data. They have some confidence that their data will be preserved over time. There's been some cleaning and standardization, so their data is more kind of able to be kind of used in association with other data, and enhanced citation rates. There's definitely good evidence that when you put your data into open resources like that, you get cited more. So there's a sort of citation benefit that goes with that. Data synthesizers, they help by helping get new data added to Neotoma. They can often detect errors that were missed during time of upload. They can update or refine age models. They can contribute to data standardization efforts. They can start to link Neotoma to other data resources that are out there. So there's another set of services that the data synthesizers can provide. And then in return, Neotoma makes it easier for them to find data, to get some data that already has some pre-cleaning done for it. So there's this important two-way symbiosis in all these different directions. And so a very, very, very important concept in Neotoma is a concept of constituent databases. And this is, I just want to emphasize this as much as possible, because Neotoma did not appear de novo. Prior to Neotoma, there have been many decades of efforts of the European pollen database, of the African pollen database. These efforts can be traced back at least to the mid-1990s and arguably earlier, as people went from building their own sites to recognize they want to do larger scale syntheses, to gathering communities together to work on this problem together. There's been a long-standing tradition in paleoecology of building these multi-site data resources. And so I really see Neotoma as a natural evolution in this process that builds upon these prior efforts. And so a key challenge then, and a key need, is to make sure that these individual groups are recognized for their effort, right? Because the Neotoma database makes it possible for people to find data in the European pollen database, but the European pollen database is its own distinct entity with its own distinct set of stewards that are doing the work and gathering the data and improving the data. And so EPD needs to be recognized and supported as much as, say, Neotoma needs to be recognized and supported. So then, this could be, and there's no inherent limit to number of constituent databases. So if there's other people out there who think about, well, for my region, for my taxonomic group, I don't have a place to put my data. One solution, one option is to create a constituent database, join Neotoma, get people trained as data stewards and start to upload data to Neotoma. And then that becomes a way you can power your own kind of regional scale or larger scale data syntheses using the Neotoma support and services. And within that, any number of things could happen. You could, have your own logo. You could have your own web portal in which, you could, and we're currently, for example, working with colleagues in Australia for the KABA initiative, where they'll be putting pollen data into Neotoma, but they're going to build their own front-end web portal that's a KABA portal for the data of Australia that will draw upon Neotoma resources. So all such things are possible. The constituent databases are in charge of appointing their own stewards and taxonomic experts. They decide who is in charge of these sorts of decisions. And then it facilitates these sort of crowdsourcing efforts and data mobilization campaigns. So for example, right now, supported by the Belmont Forum and led by Nick McKay, Anne-Marie Lazine, Sarah Ivory, and others, the African Pollen Database is doing an effort to add records that are known to be out there and add them to Neotoma and then make them available to the community through Neotoma and through other portals as well. There's a HOPE project in Bergen that's doing a lot of work with the European Pollen Database. I should also say the Latin American Pollen Database. So it becomes this way you can have this nice synergy between a research initiative in an area, adding data in Neotoma, and then pulling data out to do whatever the questions that they want to pursue. Our data use policy is a Creative Commons 4.0 license in which any use is allowed as long as you properly attribute and cite Neotoma data. And we recently revised our data use policy earlier this year to clarify what proper attribution means. There's really 3 levels of citation that we'd like to see happen. We'd like to see Neotoma itself, of course, cited, and the data use policy explains that more clearly about how to do that. We'd also like the constituent databases to be cited. So if you're really doing a project, say, in Latin America, and you're heavily drawing upon the Latin American pollen database, we'd like you to cite the Latin American pollen database and mention it specifically. And then we'd like you to cite all the individual records associated with all the individual data sets. And so that, of course, could be thousands of citations. That's one of the great challenges in this day and age. If you're doing a global synthesis with thousands of records, how do you cite them all? That's where, as we'll talk about in a couple slides, having things like DOIs and data identifiers makes it possible for people to trace back the work that they're doing at the global synthesis scale all the way back to the individual site scale. And one thing we allow is that constituent databases can clarify how they want to be cited. So if you want to be a constituent database and say we want to be recognized in this way, we can easily amend the policy to support that. So for example, the European pollen database, oops, a little typo though there, and the Alpine pollen database, Alpadaba, in our data use policy specify how they would like to be cited and some of the specific papers that they would like to be as their citation endpoints. So that's a way that if you want to use Neotoma and EPD data in Neotoma, here's how to cite it appropriately. One, as I mentioned a moment ago, we now assign DOIs to all data sets in Neotoma. So every data set in Neotoma gets a unique data identifier. This has been work led by Simon Goring, working with the data site minting service for DOIs. And one of the things that's in temporary hiatus as we're doing this migration, but is ready to go otherwise, is having every data set having its own unique landing page, its own unique web page that gives a quick summary of the site and its characteristics and the data at the site. And this is really well suited for web crawlers like Google Datasets or other kinds of automated services to go find your data. So this is an approach that we think will really help improve the data discoverability and the ability for people to find data in Neotoma and use it for all kinds of different things. And oops, that council listed right is a year out of date, but in terms of the governance, it's really important to be transparent about how governance works. And so we have the Leadership Council. The Leadership Council, people serve 4-year terms. We run an annual election in which 1/4 of the board is elected every year. And we have our next election coming up in December of this year. And then the Neotoma Leadership Council then appoints and internally votes for the executive members. And the executive, the Leadership Council meets a couple times a year, and then the executive group meets maybe once a month or so to kind of move things forward and move things along. Oh, and who elects the Leadership Council? Well, the Neotoma members do. And if you want to become a Neotoma member, we also have a basic open membership policy. So if you'd like to join Neotoma and become a voting member that elects the Leadership Council, just go to that link there and sign up. We will just do a very quick screen to make sure we're not getting some kind of random troll or bot in there. But that's a very, very, very low bar to pass. And the default is that people are joining up as members. We also run workshops to get people trained how to use Neotoma data. We usually have sort of 2 standard workshops. One is to sort of train people in the software services like the Explorer or the R package and how to use those. And then we have another workshop series that's aimed towards the data stewards, teaching people how to use the software and how to get trained to start to upload data into Neotoma. All right. Let me just check time here. All right, it's 7:30. Okay. So talk for maybe another 5 or 10 minutes or so. Software services, the kind of things that we support. This is a slight redesign of that figure I showed earlier on that kind of clarifies thinking about this as a software stack. This is kind of a common concept now in the kind of the online database and software development world, where you kind of have a whole stack series of software layers. And I've sort of gone from top to bottom here, in which at the top of the stack, you can also think as like the foundation on the bottom of the stack, you have the database itself, the relational database, and the data stored in the database, and that's kind of primary archive point. And then that's sitting on a server somewhere. And then you have the APIs, these programmatic endpoints that allow people to query into the database, which otherwise is firewalled and you just can't go in and start to touch the data willy-nilly. But the APIs are specified programmatic access points that allow you to go in and pull data to get the site data, or go in and get the occurrence data, or go in and get the contact info for the investigators, and so forth. So this API layer is a primary layer that allows the outside world to access into the database, mostly for the purposes of getting data. And then the software services, Explore, Tilia, and the Neotoma R package all sit on top of, or I guess in this model, underneath the APIs, and then use the APIs, and then create these different user interfaces. And then other people have built their own services based upon these APIs. And so this kind of sort of API structure really allows lots of different people to build their own tools and resources using Neotoma data in lots of different ways. So Explore is designed for kind of quick look visualizations. It's great for teaching purposes. I use it all the time for just kind of looking up sites like, oh, such and such a site by such and such a person, what does it have? And so here's a quick lookup for Cupola Pond in Missouri. I did a search for all pollen records that had data between 14,000 and 12,000 years ago. And here's what I pulled, and took a look at Cupola in Missouri. Once you've picked a site, you can build a quick diagram of all the taxa on the site and their relative abundances. So it's sort of a classic quick look pollen diagram or stratigraphic diagram. Currently supported only for pollen, but we have on local development, almost ready for public release, a version of this that will work with any data type in Neotoma. So this will be extended very soon to many more data types in Neotoma. And then we have the APIs, the programmatic interface. And I won't go into those here, except to say, here's the URL. If you are interested in building your own tools or building your own ways of doing programmatic access, you can go here for more info. And then the R package, probably most people are doing scientific applications, often work in R these days. And so we have the R package that has these various defined functions for getting data out of Neotoma, and we have there. And then Tilia. Tilia is this Windows based package for looking at the data and metadata. It's very site based, so you can kind of go a site at a time, and you can then look in great detail the metadata for that site, the data for that site, and you can both download data from Neotoma into Tilia and look at what you've got and do maybe some edits to it if you're a steward, and then you can push data up to Tilia. And there's a couple different versions of Tilia out there. And so there's a standard version that anybody can use that will let you pull data from Neotoma and make a pollen diagram or other kind of basic things, but only stewards can upload data to Neotoma. They have a password, a user account, so it has restricted access for uploads to Neotoma. One important thing that's, this is, for this moment in time, over the last month or two, we've been going through a big migration process, in which everything I've just described to you used to be based off of a Windows server with SQL Server as the relational database sitting behind everything. We have been over the last couple of years been moving everything over bit by bit to a Linux server and having a Postgres database as the back end. And so we have been basically moved the database over, and then we've been redirecting or revising all the software to point to the new database. And we're in this sort of kind of midstream point where, on the one hand, we have the Windows version of everything that is all active but frozen. We're not changing them anymore. The database itself is not changing anymore. And now we have a new version, the Postgres version, in which the database is released. We are now doing some test adds of data to it through Tilia, so it's starting to become the living version. And we are in the process of making sure that all the software services work. So we have kind of this current of the moment software status. And because we know that people are using our services, they want to know how things are doing, we have a spreadsheet down below there that we're going to be sort of updating weekly to kind of give updates of where things are, what the status of things are. And the Slack channel is also a good place to keep track of this migration process and where things are. We want to get this done as soon as possible because we want to move on to building new things and not just migrating over current things. So if we think about what's next on our kind of our to build and to do list, we have for Explore, there's lots of little things we want to do. We want to release that stratigraphic diagram or 2.0 that I mentioned. It's like we basically like Explore as is, but there's lots of little cosmetic tweaks, a little minor fixes and improvements here or there we want to do that will make improve life for people based on what user requests have come to us. We want to, as a kind of a major new area that we'll be working on over the next couple years, is right now Tilia is very much based upon a one site at a time model, and that's great. But it's hard if you want to say import in, if you're a constituent database, you've already got 1,000 records that you've got on hand. Tilia is a bit of a slow process to go everything through Tilia. So we want to create new tools to allow our larger volume data uploads. And so we are kind of starting to build some new tools for that. This is at the very, very, very early design stage right now. I don't think I mentioned it yet, but Nick McKay has been working on an exporter that exports Neotoma data into the lipid format, which has become a very popular paleoclimatic data format and data standard. So he has a version of that already, and we want to move to just keep building that out and integrating it more and more with our services. We want to, Simon is going to be doing a new release of the Neotoma R package, a 2.0, that will, there's definitely some clunkiness in the current version of the Neotoma R package. We want to make that simpler. We want to add new functionality in response to user requests. And we're also at the kind of the early design and development stage of that. That will be a fall priority for Simon. We want to rebuild the website. And we want to get better tools for tracking our data usage, both so that at Neotoma, we can tell our supporters, here's all the things that we're doing and supporting. So we want to be able to track our usage and impact. And then we also would like to make these kind of services available for our individual data contributors as well, letting people know when their data is getting cited and used and so forth. And all the things above there are being supported right now by the National Science Foundation. And we have a 3-year geoinformatics grant that we've got about 3, 4 years on. I'll just say a few minutes about science. I've spent all this time talking about infrastructure and data models and so forth. And it's really easy to go down the rabbit hole of building these data resources and software services. And that's great. You want to do that. It's super important for the field. But of course, at the end of the day, you want to really, the question is, are you connecting all this to science? And are you powering new kinds of science that couldn't have been done otherwise? And so, we as an open resource recognize that to some degree, our effort will make other people's science better, right? That we don't expect to be co-authors on every paper that uses Neotoma data. We have our own science that we want to do and that we'll be a part of and are happy to participate in. But so some of these projects that write are these kind of regional to global scale synthesis projects, some of which we're involved in, some of which we're less involved in, and that's all to the good. And that we really see what we do want is to make sure as much as possible this is a two-way loop, that Neotoma helps provide data out to these different efforts, and these different efforts return value back by doing things like training data stewards and getting new records added to Neotoma that we didn't have yet, by helping with data checking and improvement, age model updates, and all the rest. So we see this sort of two-way synergy between Neotoma providing these foundational services and data and these other projects doing these kind of value-added science-oriented projects. I think we've been successful there. So we see the sort of rate of tracking of publication rate of papers using Neotoma data left there. A few highlights of some different papers that have used Neotoma data, some nature climate change type papers that right there. And then just kind of one example, this is Darrell's moderating this, of pointing to one of his papers where he's of course been really leading this effort. I think it's very, very, very commendable effort towards building global paleoclimate data products and inferences that are fully open and transparent, where you can look at a map like this and trace it all the way back to the individual records that powered this. So really making sure that we are doing transparent, open science, that if we go to a congressional hearing and say we know the world is warming, that we could in principle document and provenance all the way back to the first point of origin for these data points. So this is a data paper that presenting this new database of Holocene paleotemperature records. The green dots are pollen. Probably most or all of those green dots are Neotoma records, and pulling in other sources as well. So this isn't all Neotoma data, but there's definitely Neotoma data contributing to this. And as I put this together, I thought it was important to make an important point about what Neotoma does and doesn't store, because I think this is a good example of thinking about that. What Neotoma does store is, as much as possible, the raw data, the occurrences of bones at different site localities, the counts or abundances of diatoms or pollen or ostracods or what have you. Geochemical measurements such as stable isotopes, the radiocarbon dates, the taxon names, the inferred ages. Those are things that Neotoma does store. What we typically have avoided storing so far are the derived variables, July mean temperature, biodiversity indices like species richness or turnover. Those more derived products we see as outside our mission. And so for us, we see what we do at Neotoma is very complementary, for example, to what this paleotemperature product, because we're kind of more of a foundational data layer that stores the raw information. And then this is more of a derived data product with this very, how did you get those temperature estimates and certainties of them and the methodologies of that. That's all information that's largely stored outside of Neotoma, but is then founded upon Neotoma. We don't store images, just another example. There's no hard rule that we couldn't do these things, but they're not part of our core mission right now. Another project that I've been involved in recently, and this has been with the HOPE team, led by John Bertz and others in Bergen, Norway, with Andre Model and Suzette Flanto as some of the key leaders in terms of doing, as postdocs, doing the active work. This is a project we're working on. This is taking some of the currently available pollen data in Neotoma. This is roughly a April to May snapshot here. And then basically asking what are the global patterns and rates of vegetation change over the last 20,000 years. So that's our site map up top. The lower right plot shows our time distribution of these different continents, data distribution, and then some of the standard things that might be causing vegetation change in plots BCD. Growth of human agricultural and land use, climate represented by GRIP, and CO2 rises. So it's a representative, important time series. And last slide or two, I just want to mention this, and there's a lot here, so I won't go into this in detail, but let's note it. We can come back if we want to talk more about it. Neotoma is part of a larger ecosystem. There's some kinds of data that we curate, and there's other kinds of data that other people curate. And so big goals, in addition to kind of building our own internal data resources and bringing data in and building new tools to support the kinds of things that we want to do, another very important mission is to better link out to other resources. And so this is just kind of a quick summary of some of the active partnering and data integration and linking efforts that are underway. And you can see there's the NOAA portal that I mentioned before, the Earth Life Consortium, Linked Earth, and this Neotoma to lipid exporter. So there's more going on there, and I'm happy to circle back to any of this, but just to kind of say that we see ourselves as part of a broader ecosystem and that we are one node in a larger network. I'll kind of just finish here by just kind of leaving up some summary resources. I know I covered a lot of ground quickly, and so here are some of the links of different kinds of things that might be useful if you want to learn more. And as always, if you want to just drop an email saying, hey, I'd like to become a data steward, or I'd like to contribute data, or I'd like to learn more how about use the R package, just reach out to us by email, by Twitter. You can email my personal email address. Happy to talk more. And I'll just finish by, again, thanking everybody who's contributed to this, and I'll open up for questions at this point. So thank you for your time here.
Thank you, Jack, for that very informative review of Neotoma and its many functions. So let's see. I'd like to open it up for questions. Feel free to join in on the chat, and I'd be happy to moderate that. Or you may open your mics. I believe, Sarah, participants have that ability. So let's see. Our friend Mike Evans has been busy on the chat. Mike, do you want to open your mic and choose among the the topics that you've already brought up in the chat, or can you do that?
Yeah, sure. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Sounds
like it. Yeah, hi. This was fabulous and really fun and a great introduction for me. Let me ask just two of the questions. Well, one question in the chat and then one a science question. The question in the chat is, I saw that Bruce Bauer was also here. And I was wondering if between the two of you, you could compare and contrast like the WDCA Paleo with Neotoma. The second question was more science related. I was wondering to what extent you have explored the spatial and temporal biases and the sort of syntheses you were showing in the in those last few figures, the rates of change in ecosystems over time. Thanks.
Yeah. Great questions both. Let's do the first. Let's go in kind of first then second. Bruce, do you want? I just kind of gave my Neotoma spiel. Do you want to talk maybe for a moment or two about WCA and similarities or differences? And you're not hearing you. Maybe your mic off. I'll start and then chime in. Yeah, I think obviously some very similar missions, right? Of archiving and making available data. Obviously is a different scope in that NOAA is traditionally focused on climatic data, and NOAA started earlier when the mission was really focused on paleoclimate and understanding the past climate system, and that proxies were gathered in service of that mission. Neotoma is really focused on understanding ecological and biospheric dynamics, and sometimes those missions overlap because, say, pollen is a well-established paleoclimate proxy, and it is also used to study, say, vegetation dynamics. But then there's other things like vertebrates, which aren't as widely used as paleoclimatic proxies, but are really important too. So it's a classic Venn diagram where if you looked at our data sets that we store and the data sets that WDCA stores, you'd find some that could be plausibly stored in either one, and then some that are very clearly one or very clearly the other. That's one sort of thematic difference. And then if you kind of get into the underlying data structure, Neotoma, as I sort of said, is this Postgres model with these defined relationships and hierarchy and so forth. All these different data resources all have some underlying data model that at the surface level seems, oh, they're all the same. They're storing paleoclimate data or they're storing pollen data. But those structural differences in data models end up being really important because they kind of support certain kinds of functionality or operations, and then others do. So that's kind of a vague answer, but I guess traditionally, for example, WCA received these kind of flat files that had this sort of standard flat file format. That was the way that data was entered and received. I know they've been working to sort of update that, but some of the things that we sort of presented here are made possible by the relationships we defined internally, the way that we sort of organize data hierarchically and so forth. So this updating of age models, which we can do programmatically pretty readily, may be harder, for example, with the WCA. But Bruce, are you there? Or Wendy?
I'm here. This is Carrie Morrill.
Oh, hey, Carrie. Yeah.
Oh, hi, Carrie Morrill. You could answer this question too. Yeah, and Jack also kind of touched off, he answered a couple of my other questions already in his answer. Great.
Yeah, I think Jack's explanation was great. I don't have a whole lot to add. I think that the data that we curate are complementary, and Jack talked a lot about taxonomy and systematics being an important component of what Neotoma curates, and we don't do that so much at the WDS Paleo. But on the other hand, we do devote a lot of resources towards curating the derived variables. So I think that's one example of kind of on the Venn diagram where we don't overlap so much. But I also really like Jack's description of the symbiosis between the data contributors and the data center, and the data synthesizers in the data center. And I think a lot of that goes on at the WDS Paleo as well.
Thanks, Carrie. And to tag off of that, for example, I do think that idea of these community curated data resources is really important as a general concept, because I do see that as something that has kind of emerged and evolved in lots of places. Like, what NOAA does is the same thing. People contribute their data to it. There's some standardization and harmonization that happens there, and then data is provided out to the data synthesizers. And so that same model that I described could also apply to NOAA. But who does the work and how it's done, and the exact model for that can vary from resource to resource. I've also mentioned the Paleobiology Database, which is a deep time resource that is very similar. They have people work with mollusks or deep sea ocean cores or other things, and they are also getting experts together, bringing data into the PBDB, and then making that as a common data portal for their kind of data. But because the communities are different and they're storing and focusing on different things. So Carrie, you gave the example of, we manage taxonames and you don't. That's an important difference. And in the deep time, they are also focusing on taxonames a lot, but they don't care. They are less focused on, say, radiocarbon dates and getting radiocarbon dates than we are. So the time scale leads to some different design decisions that we have focused on that they have not focused on, and vice versa.
Could you talk about, at risk of going on, could you talk about the differences in the data models? Like, it sounds like WDCA has maybe like Pangea and its own database, but Neotoma is fundamentally comprised. It's like a database of databases.
I'll talk about the Neotoma side first, and then Carrie, maybe compare and contrast. The Neotoma database is one relational database. It is one set of tables sitting on a server that has one set of relationships. So there's a sites table and a geochronology table and a PI's name table. So we have a defined set of tables and relationships among those tables. So if anybody who's worked with Access or SQL Server or Postgres, these kind of relational database structures, we have one database that holds all this information. So that's the centralized side. And that's one of the values that Neotoma provides, is providing one centralized database with one set of software based on that database that lots of communities can use potentially. But then we set up access rules that different data sets stored inside of Neotoma are tagged to be owned by different constituent databases. So there are data sitting inside of Neotoma that are tagged as NAPD, North American Pollen Database data, that I have access privileges to and can edit. There are other data sitting inside of Neotoma that are tagged as EPD data that I do not have access privileges. So we have this sort of access control that allows data stewards to edit and manage subsets of the data inside of Neotoma. And can I maybe just one more follow and add to that? I mean, I think that's an important difference between maybe just thinking about the evolution. So NOAA and WDC formed in the 1990s when the model was kind of these centralized databases, right? That all data goes into one place and the people there manage that. And so I think a challenge then is how do you do that curation and stewardship, and who does the work? Carrie, you might want to talk a little bit about who does the work when people contribute data to you. Who cleans it? Who makes sure it's kind of standardized and ready for general use? In our model, it's kind of this distributed model of different data stewards among different constituent databases that can be in a sort of franchise model. You could have more people doing that effort for different subsets of the data. But my sense is that NOAA has a little bit more of a centralized model in terms of a staff at your institute that does most of that work or works with individual scientists to get things ready.
Yeah, that's correct. I think that's a good description of a very centralized model. I see that Bruce is unmuted. Is Bruce there? Bruce would have more insights on this than I do. So, right, jump in anytime, Bruce, but I'll just start talking. So, right, we have data contributors who send us data, and there's some back and forth between our data managers and the contributors to try to get it right, get the metadata correct, do a little bit of quality assurance, especially for tree ring contributions. There's a big workflow there in terms of doing some quality assurance. And then the metadata goes into our database. The data does not. So that kind of goes back to what Jack was talking about with the flat file. So accessing the data, it's in flat files. And we also have, interaction with data synthesizers. So we provide data out to people, and then we get data back as people synthesize it into larger compilations, like, for example, the Temperature 12K project. And so that's another method by which there is some quality assurance that happens, and additional information is added through time in that way. So, but yes, it's a much more centralized model. There's not a lot of data stewards who have access to our underlying database.
Another point I'll add too, I think there's an underlying question of, should there be one database or many databases, right? Are NOAA, WDC, and Neotoma redundant with each other? Or if they're not redundant, what are the advantages and distinctions between them? And I really see that I see there's some process of consolidation in which, FaunMap does not need to be a standalone database anymore. It's part of Neotoma as a constituent database. So we have one model of aggregation in which data comes into Neotoma, gets added to it as a constituent database, and that's great. But there are things we'll never try to curate. And we'll always have these sort of finite subdomains of what's out there. So I do see this emerging ecosystem of different data resources curating different kinds of domain and knowledge. And there's always gonna be some gray areas of potential overlap between different data resources and what they do. So, but I think it's helpful to start to understand that they all have slightly different models of how they do this. They all have slightly different models of what they're storing, but they're not. I am. You can do a Pangea. Pangea tries to be sort of a database of everything, and that's great. Pangea is good for that. But what it means, the trade-off then, is that you have less customization. So they have some general service they provide for all kinds of data, but less customized services for, say, taxon name management, which is something that's really important for us. So, there can be different spectrums from more general purpose generic databases with sort of generic services versus more customized community-specific databases that meet community-specific needs.
Great. We sort of along this line, there's a question from Pierre Francus, who's asking about whether there's an option to have sort of the Neotoma data container available sort of on a lab level. Sort of along those lines, I mean, is there a way that we can sort of facilitate the transfer of data from individual labs to sort of foresee what the structure and the metadata that are needed in order to enter data into Neotoma?
Yeah, great question. So a couple different things there. Just to deal with kind of data versioning and just make sure we have kind of one master version. The Neotoma database is centralized on a server with backups and backup redundancy and stuff. But we don't yet have so a couple things. We do support database snapshots. Like every now and then we'll just do a database dump. So if you just wanted to get the full contents in the database and have it locally, you could get that. And we periodically post snapshots up to be available. So it's not quite an automatic do it every 3 months kind of thing, but it's on a on-demand basis. So if you wanted a full copy of the Neotoma database to look at and look at its data structures, we could make that available to you. Working, again, is kind of like figuring out what people's needs are. When we worked with Alpadaba, for example, this alpine pollen database, it turned out that they really did want to have their own copy of their data. So they basically put it into Neotoma, but they wanted us to kind of then dump back out a Postgres copy for them of their data, because they needed to show their the Swiss National Science Foundation that they had a data product that they could point to. And so we can then do that. So if you're a constituent database and you want to have your own copy of the data, we can kind of do that service on kind of an on-demand basis. And then, learning more about how to do this, Tilia, for example, that Tilia point of interface of uploading data to Neotoma, you can have your own copy of Tilia. You can have some example data files. So if you want to kind of get involved in that process of getting data ready for upload, we can certainly give you model data and software to work with. Feel free to follow up on that question, Pierre, if you want more specifics on that point.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, so actually, I don't need to have the whole data set. I guess I can access that on the website. It was just more the structure of the database. So I'm thinking of the students when they arrive in a lab, they don't know what to do with a sediment core, what information they have to record, and so on and so on. So having a database that is already available in the lab, and we can store in the very well-conceived way all the data we are collecting. Yeah. And it's even prior we upload the data to any database, but it's just to have this kind of, to learn to have the student learning how they have to proceed with the data, and in order to better share them with the community.
It's a great question. We don't really have a lab information management system. That would be a nice thing to have. It's still a bit of people doing it on our own. In my lab, we would still, count and have data in Excel files, and we would, copy over, import to Tilia. Tilia is kind of the main upload interface, and then we would bring it to Neotoma. So it's cumbersome and it's not the best system. We have some colleagues in Australia who have developed a tablet-based pollen counter. And so I think one of the really exciting ideas is to have like a tablet-based pollen counter that then generates the data in a ready-to-import data format. We haven't built that yet, but that is a idea that's just waiting for somebody to do it, kind of thing. So that would be a step in the direction that I think you're asking about. Yeah.
Other questions? Well, I'd like to ask one. I understand that the foundation of the Neotoma database are the constituent databases, and I'm wondering sort of what constitutes a constituent database. So I can imagine a Pages working group, for example, that develops a data synthesis sort of product. Let's say sea ice in Antarctica, and we've got a couple dozen cores with various indicators of sea ice extent back in time. Does that constitute a constituent database, or does that kind of get parsed into the different proxy types and then we confer with those proxy experts, or how would that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, one of the things I personally like about the constituent database is that it's a very flexible concept. Because these things can happen in so many different ways, it's hard to be overly prescriptive about it. I would say the most common way that a constituent database is defined is by a proxy type and by a geographic region. So the North American pollen database, the international ostracod database. So, anywhere, but it's still kind of that those are two different examples of different geographic domains, but by one proxy type. I'm trying to think of, I feel like there's an example of and usually go by proxy type because that's where the expertise is, right? People are diatom specialists or pollen specialists. And so you kind of want to map the constituent database onto where the expertise is. And so a multi-proxy constituent database would usually not be a great idea. But sometimes, like you said, you might have someone say, we're going to work up in the Arctic and we're going to get every paleo record we can get from the Arctic and build a database of that. And you do want to enable, then you want to have a postdoc, say, work in that project, be able to upload a bunch of pollen data and charcoal data. Right now, we only allow one data set to be owned by one constituent database. We could relax that rule in the future to say, okay, that record just got added and it's both in the North American pollen database and it's in the High Arctic synthesis database, and there's two owners of that. That could be something we could adapt to in the future. So, it's kind of on a case-by-case basis. And we would typically ask, what's, does somebody already curate this data? If so, can we just add to that existing database? If this is new, where's the gap? And I would probably also ask, how long will this project last, right? Because if it's kind of a typical research project where it's kind of 3 and done, then I might say, well, we would like to see some kind of commitment to curating this data. Think about that question beyond that 3-year time horizon. So there's a little bit of a sustained commitment question too. Sometimes it could be a lab basis. There's some labs that just generate a ton of data. You could argue they should have their own constituent database. So we don't have hard rules. We just have kind of typical examples.
Mm-hmm. That makes good sense.
Yeah.
Hard to one size fits all for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, Mike, we try to avoid redundant entries. We try to not have that. And so we try to keep an eye on that. And so that could be a risk associated with sort of constituent database proliferation. But we have some tools, part of the QA/QC during Tilia upload, some nice little tools that Eric has built, is that when you're uploading data from Tilia into Neotoma, it'll do some duplicate checks. Is there any other site with a similar name? Is there any other site? How many other sites are there within 10 kilometers? So it does some by area and by name checks. And so it starts to say, hey, wait a minute, you just uploaded a data set from this site, and there's already 5 data sets from this site. So it'll do some checking there. Mike, you asked another question in the chat window a few minutes ago that's also important about versioning. And we actually, an important thing that we traditionally have differed pretty fundamentally from other archival data resources is that Neotoma has kind of viewed its primary mission as supporting living data, that our top mission is to provide kind of latest and greatest data that has the updated age models and updated taxonomies and so forth. So that's been our top priority, but that creates that issue of versioning and reproducibility and archival. And journals specifically really want the data at the time of submission recorded. So now our new system is to basically support 2 versions of the data: the time of submission version, which will support journal needs, and then the living version, which will support most practicing researcher needs. But we don't version at this point in between those 2.
Excellent. Other questions? Well, okay then. So we will post this video recording on Paige's YouTube channel, I believe. So if you have colleagues or others who would benefit from listening in, that will be available next week. So thank you, Jack, very much for the very informative presentation. And thank you, Sarah, and others at the Paige's IPO for hosting this webinar. And thanks to our audience. There's Sarah. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Darrell. And again, if people are interested in becoming a member or contributing data, just reach out. We're happy to help any way we can. Thanks, everybody.